All right, let's go ahead and get started. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Joshua Perry. We were talking about whether to be called doctor or not. Well, I'm going to say Dr. Perry has a Master of Theologic Studies from Vanderbilt University Divinity School and a Doctor of Jurisprudence from Vanderbilt University Law School. He has taught several courses with respect to law and ethics. He is Jesse Fine Fellow in Practical Ethics, Life Sciences Research Fellow at the Kelley School of Business, Assistant Professor of Business and Law at the Kelley School of Business. And he's here to speak to us today about what counts as success in the realm of ethics. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really great to be here. Thank you all for attending. I'm looking forward to what I hope will be something of an interactive session. They told me right after I got here that it would be recorded and that there aren't microphones for everybody. So perhaps there's a challenge for those who will be viewing it down the road. But I want us to have some fun, at least those of us who have made it out on this frigid day. And so for the next hour or so, I want to explore this question of ethics. And ultimately, we're going to lead up to a real-life clinical encounter that I had. So I appreciate the introduction. My primary training is in the law. I had this degree in ethics from Divinity School. After practicing law for a couple of years, I worked at the Vanderbilt University Medical Center in their bioethics center there, working on a variety of academic and scholarly questions around health law and end-of-life issues, but also carrying the pager as an ethics consultant on the ethics consultation service, both in the adult and the pediatric hospitals there at Vanderbilt. So I did that for a number of years, and all of that by way of background, because that was the context out of which the case that we'll discuss in just a little while arises. So I sort of see this talk as sort of two trajectories. The first, I want to talk just sort of generally about ethics. What we're talking about in terms of ethical decision-making and how we make decisions, some of the more complicating components. And then we'll move more specifically into the healthcare environment and take up this rather difficult case I encountered one Saturday morning. Okay? That's sort of the outline for how I want to proceed. Let me also say this. I have an IU email address, which is flooded this time of year by students. So if you really want to reach me, this is my personal email address, and I get at that on my phone. If you have any questions, or in particular, if you want any follow-up literature, I don't have a lot of footnotes and references on the slides, but I'm happy to inundate you with PDFs and reprints. In particular, the case I'm going to talk about was actually written up for the Hastings Center report a couple of years ago. And so if you would like to explore that, happy to make that available as well. Okay? Let's jump in. So what are we talking about when we ask this question, ethics? You know, and I think it's one way at least to sort of kill a dinner party, at least for me, to say I teach ethics. It's a sort of a ticklish subject. And I think people have lots of different views, and I think if you're in teaching in a law school, where I taught for a while, or in a medical school, which I did back at Vanderbilt, or now here at Kelley in a business school, depending on your context, ethics can mean different things and look different ways. So I know many of you have the slides in front of you. I never give my slides in advance to my students because it's such a spoiler. You know what's coming up next on some of these slides. So that's fine if you want to look at them or take notes. But if you just want to engage with the material as I process it, that would be fine too. But it's up to you. So one view of ethics, and this is a view I don't hold, but many do, particularly many in the corporate world, many in the business world, that ethics is really nothing more than compliance. It's staying on the right side of the regulators, right side of the law. I know there's all sorts of compliance issues, JCAHO-related concerns here in the hospital environment. And so not to minimize the importance of compliance, right? None of us wants to go to jail, right, or pay fines, or lose our licenses, obviously. But I think ethics is something a little more robust. Another way of thinking about it, some just equate it with morality. We talk about ethics, talk about doing the right thing, and sometimes this gets put in the form of prohibitions, right? Some of these looks are almost sort of biblical, right? I mean, it all sort of gets mashed up sometimes in our thinking. Don't kill, tell the truth, do not harm another. I mean, that last one in particular, a big one for those in the healthcare profession. Do not harm. And then these become complicated depending on our professional or occupational context. So, for the military person, the prohibition against killing is complicated. I kid my lawyer friends, right? Because the prohibition against telling lies, or shall I say, telling the truth, it's complicated in the legal context, let's be fair. You spend an entire semester, really, exploring what the truth is, what is for my lawyer friends. And then, of course, in medicine, in fact, we're not about harming people, but some of us, surgeons in the room, we cut people, right? We do have to do what in ordinary society would be prohibited, namely taking out a blade and slicing somebody open, right? So depending on the context, things can look very different. So for me, the bottom line is this. I've sort of been working on this for a while, and it's sort of an expansive, all-encompassing concept that says, look, I think ethics really is something along the lines of awareness. It's driven by awareness, driven by an appreciation that values are in conflict all the time, and we have to make trade-offs, okay? Because priorities are competing here at the hospital. Priorities to individual patients are competing with scarce resources, with economic considerations. We have these trade-offs and these conflicts at many turns. And we have, the last line, a variety of people who have a stake in the outcome, okay? Whether it be ourselves and our own sort of professional flourishing and career longevity, whether it be the patient's family, the community, some special interest group, who knows? But there are many in most contexts. And so recognizing, heightening awareness, and then appreciating the conflicts. I think this is a broad definition to be sure. We'll explore it, put a little bit of meat on the bones here as we go forward. So I also think about ethics as a practice, not surprisingly. I spent some time practicing law. I spent about 4.5 years at the Vanderbilt Medical Center watching physicians practice medicine. So this concept of an endeavor as a practice, I think, has some real payoff. And so I think about ethics in these terms. So it's this, and what is a practice, right? It's a process where you are deliberate, you are thoughtful about who you are, what values are animating you, what priorities are driving you, and what values are driving others. We'll talk about this case in a few moments. It's an end-of-life case that I want to talk about. And those that work in the ICU, work in the end-of-life environment, people have different views on sanctity of life, quality of life. I mean, these are contested terms with lots of different perspectives. And so ethics is ultimately, at least in large part, about recognizing, paying attention to just that very fact. And then the second bit, why we think and act the way we do, why others think and act the way they do, so that we can make a decision. We have to move forward with the end-of-life decision, with the decision around extreme premature life. So both ends of the spectrum and everywhere in between, particularly in this environment where ethical issues arise every day, we ultimately have to find a way forward that ideally harmonizes where we are as a person and as a professional, what we're committed to, and what this organization is all about. Okay? So, I said we're going to talk generally for a little while, and then we'll move into a specific clinical context. But generally, how best to practice ethics. So this is now the second or third time on the slides I have referred to reflective awareness. What am I really getting at here? Well, there is an entire field of empirical, data-driven research that's sort of come online in the last 10 or 15 years. And it goes under the heading of behavioral ethics. And it really poses the question, why do good people make very poor choices? Why do you see coaches of Little League, church elders, upstanding pillars of one's community on the front page of the Wall Street Journal from time to time in handcuffs? What's that about? And so it's taken real hold in the business world, but really it has application way beyond that. Let me read a couple of quotes and see if you agree or disagree. These are some of the findings from some of the leading researchers in this field. Here's one from Francesca Gino. She says, the empirical evidence seems to point to the conclusion that we lie and cheat much more often than we care to admit. At the same time, we strive to maintain a positive image of ourselves, and moral values are a central component of our self-image. Another view from Dan Ariely, who's got a number of TED Talks, a number of popular New York Times bestsellings. He's sort of much like Malcolm Gladwell. Dan Ariely has taken these academic, scholarly papers and translated them into a popular outlet. Maybe you've heard of Ariely. Here's his view. Essentially, we cheat up to the level that allows us to retain our self-image as reasonably honest individuals. We'd all say we are reasonably, maybe above average, sort of the Garrison Keillor model, right? Maybe we are all sort of above average when it comes to our levels of honesty. We would all probably say that. In fact, surveys reveal that over 90% of the population believes they're really, really ethical. Okay. And yet we do have lots of unethical actions all around us. So one more of these quotes. This comes from Mark Matusek, another scholar in this field. He says this: evolution prepared us humans to be devious, to be self-serving, and only half honest, inclined to grab the lion's share of goodies without being thrown out of the group. Hardwired into us is the claim. Homo sapiens became wired for truthfulness only to the extent that it suited us, pleased others, and preserved our reputations. We are willing to break rules to benefit ourselves, but only within limits we can justify. We are good and fair most of the time, at least in our own minds, but that doesn't exactly make us straight shooters. Our internal cop stops us only when we contemplate big transgressions. All right, so agree or disagree with the claims being made. We could do a whole series of seminars like this, further exploring this research that tries to get at, and I think is getting at, some of the more unconscious, subconscious biases, influences that many of us aren't even aware of, or because our lives are so busy and we're so sleep deprived, we're just not always fully engaged or prepared to make the sort of best judgments that we can be most proud of. There's a whole field of this evidence that's out there, and I had it under reflective awareness, absolutely critical, I think, to practicing ethics. Recognition and understanding that there are a variety of traditions, a variety of orientations, of ways of understanding moral dilemmas, ways of understanding conflicting and competing values. And I've got several brief illustrations I want to talk about in just a second, so I won't belabor that second bullet. And then this third one, the upshot here, the spoiler alert for really the whole talk, and what counts as success ultimately, which is an open question. There won't be a firm final announcement on that. We'll discuss it together in a little while. But this necessity of always recognizing that we don't know enough. We need to know more. Taking a position, particularly in the clinical encounter, of humility is absolutely fundamental, I want to argue, to practicing ethics, either generally in our daily lives, but particularly in the clinical context. Okay, so I promised 3 brief illustrations, further exploring the second bullet. I get to use my toy. Second, more fully exploring what this means. What this means, traditions, frameworks, orientations help guide us to the way people see ethics differently. What am I getting at there? Well, I'm getting at this. Imagine, you don't have to imagine, many of you live this in real time in the newspaper and on every cable TV station back around 2005 when this really came to a head. But this Terri Schiavo saga that began in 1990 when Ms. Schiavo experienced a cardiac arrest event and wound up in a coma. And 15 years later, she's still being maintained through artificial hydration and nutrition. And those of you who, show of hands, folks who recall something about the Terri Schiavo case, either you've read about it or you lived it, you paid attention in real time. So most of you, I can give this, I've written quite a bit about the Terri Schiavo case, I should say. Could do several sessions on that. But just the bottom line you'll recall is that there was a dispute, became a legal dispute, became a political dispute, really quite a watershed moment in our sort of biomedical history, bioethics history. But the husband, Mr. Schiavo, Michael Schiavo, wanted, he said, to follow the principle of autonomy. He didn't actually use those words, but that's what he was saying, that his wife, in fact, had told him she would never want to live in this persistent vegetative state, which every reputable neurologist had confirmed, and that later reports after her death would confirm with analysis of her brain. And so that was one position. On the other side, her parents argued with great emotion that they owed a duty to their daughter for whom they had promised to always care. And furthermore, that their deeply held values, and they believed the deeply held values of their daughter, were focused on a commitment to the sanctity of life. And that in their view, it would be a violation of these deeply held principles to remove the artificial hydration and nutrition. So they wanted to preserve indefinitely on the witness stand during one of the many court battles. They even testified they would be in favor of organ transplantation, amputation, dialysis, whatever it took to maintain the biological life of their daughter. That was their deeply held rule, their principle of approaching this. And the husband said, no, this is not what my wife would want. And so out of a respect for her autonomy, we must remove her and let her pass. Illustration number 2, much briefer. I had not written about this, but know a little bit about it because I did study Dr. King in divinity school. Imagine you are a reporter in the early 1960s, mid-1960s, and you are on the trail. You're out covering the civil rights movement. You're covering Dr. King and his speeches, and you are out on the road traveling with Dr. King and his team. And along the way, you, the reporter, come into information, scandalous information of marital infidelities, behavior that would tarnish Dr. King's moral standing. What do you do? What do you do? You know that publicizing these private matters would only undermine, perhaps set back, the greater good, the civil rights pioneering the work of Dr. King. And yet, you also know that you have a professional responsibility to inform. What do you do? Number 3, professor who witnesses the star basketball player cheating on an exam. And the professor asks herself, who am I? What am I doing? I'm in the field of education. I'm in the field of developing the next generation, the best and the brightest here at IU. Trying to do what I can to bring these students along, academically to be sure, but also more holistically. What do I do? Do I tell the coach, head coach, the dean? Do I just fail the student for undisclosed reasons? Maybe they just had a poor exam. What do I do, and what does it say about me as a professor, the decision that I make? In my commitments, in my obligations to the students, to my fellow faculty, to the institution, to the people of Indiana? What do I do, and how can I live with myself? I want to feel good about myself when I look in the mirror and I come in this classroom the next day. So what do I do? Okay, so 3 really complicated and juicy illustrations, and I want to sort of map them on to this continuum, like this. So I want to suggest that the Schiavo case illustrates for us, number 1, in the middle, okay, competing and conflicting principles. I want to suggest that our reporter, who knows some really salacious information about civil rights movement, civil rights leader, that's somewhere around number 2. The concerns there are, what are the consequences of revealing? And then I want to suggest that number 3 reflects that third illustration of the professor who's deeply concerned about virtues of honesty, of academic integrity, of playing by the rules, and of fairness, to be sure, accountability. And these are character traits that this professor is deeply concerned about. I want to suggest that's on the far left there, the virtue perspective. Okay? And the argument here, or the claim, I guess, is that each one of these sort of entry points into an action gives us a view into how people wrestle with ethical dilemmas. Let me say more about each one, and we'll see how this is making sense. So this first one, the question here focuses on rules, focuses on principles, regardless of consequences. Okay? Regardless of consequences. Mr. and Mrs. Schiavo, or actually Mr. and Mrs. Schindler, Terry Schindler, Schiavo's parents, they were committed deeply to what they understood to be the sanctity of life. And the consequences for the body of their daughter, again, amputations, dialysis, organ transplantation, it was all permissible. That was not the concern. The concern was, what is the rule on point in this dilemma? And for them, the rule on point was, life is precious. On the other side of this coin, the husband, Michael Schiavo, for him, it was different. For him, the rule on point was autonomy. The dignity of his wife not to be preserved as some sort of biological, barely sort of biologically functioning body, but something much richer about what his wife would have said if she could say. And so there are a number of ways that this view, that this approach gets framed. But here's the bottom line. The right thing to do is determined regardless of whether or not the consequences are good or bad. You do the right thing. You follow the rules. You do your duty. Okay? And some of you who have encountered people, patients' families, or patients themselves, you've heard this sort of talk before. Right? We operate in various spheres around with this sort of frame. Okay? This should resonate, I think. The second one. So here we have the reporter, right?